Chavre, how are you? I hope everyone is gesund, stark, und freilich, begashmus und beruchnis. I hope everyone is healthy, strong, and happy physically and spiritually. Ever since the war started, we've added tzedakah mekarev sagula. Tzedakah is a protection. Tzedakah is from the greatest mitzvahs. We're giving tzedakah now that we should win the war, and Mashiach should come now. We're going to say a prayer today, which is going to address the subject that we're talking about today, the thought of the week for Parshas Acharei and Kedoshim, that's going to address possibly the most fundamental issue in Yiddishkeit, which is Jewish identity. So first we'll start with the prayer. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam shelo yosani goy. Bless you, Hashem, King of the universe, who has not made me a Gentile. So my friends, anybody who has an issue with this, please forgive me. My main intention when I make these videos in general is I'm talking to, like the Alter Rebbe says in this Tanya, B'yoidai u'makirai k'amina. I'm talking to people that I know, and in my case, I'm primarily addressing what I speak to my students. So, if someone has an issue with this whole idea that Hashem chose the Jewish nation, and we actually make a blessing from the first blessings at the very beginning of the day, Shelo Yasani Goy, just to understand how great and important this blessing is, that it's a famous story that the Levitzchak Maditchev was once in synagogue, and he was exceedingly exuberant and joyous. Somebody walked over to him and said, "What are you so happy about? So early in the morning? You just got up." He said, "What are you talking about? I just made the blessing, Shelo Yasani Goy." In other words, that is truly the greatest source of joy. Your very identity, your very individuality, that is the greatest thing, and that is the greatest thing for which you should be happy about. So, we've spoken many times how when we have a parsha, the Alter Rebbe said in Daf Leb Mitzayt, and we have to live with the parsha of the week, internalize it, absorb it, and like I always said many times, we have to listen to the messages that Hashem is sending you. Keep your eyes open, be on the lookout for Hashem's guidance. He's speaking to us through the parsha. What is something, and I'm always looking to see something which I feel I should pay attention to. So there's one pasuk, one concept, which is actually almost identical in Parshas Acharei and Parshas Kedoshim. And that is, we're going to speak, review the psukim, say the psukim, and then we'll talk about the general issue. So, in Parshas Acharei, Kapitel Yud Ches, Pasuk Gimel, the pasuk says, "K'maiseh eretz Mitzrayim asher yishavtem bo loisasu, u'k'maiseh eretz Canaan asher imevi eschem shama loisasu, u'v'chukeiseyem loiselechu." Like the practice of the land of Egypt in which you dwell, do not do, and do not perform the practice of the land of Canaan, for which I bring you, and do not follow their statutes. Rashi, on the words, Uv'chukeiseyem loiselechu, do not follow their statutes, which is the statutes, the ways of the Goyim. Uv'chukeiseyem loiselechu means don't go in their ways, but the word is statutes. So he says, what are we talking about? Elu nimusei shalehem. These are their traditions. Dvarim achkukim lehem. Matters that are etched for them in the ways as if they were laws. You know, certain things become in or hot, and it really makes no sense. Or certain ways that are fixed in society, that also doesn't make sense. And he says, Kigoin tartrigois, such as theaters, the stadios and stadiums, i.e. days set aside for attendance at theaters or stadiums. Okay, but it's not only about days set aside. It means the whole culture. Like in the Romans, they had the gladiators, And the spectacle was to see how a human being slaughters an animal, or an animal would slaughter a human being. Simple bloodlust, the lowest sort of virtue you could imagine. Or today, boxing, watching how one human being is bashing the brains out of another human being. And people are cheering on, and it's for money, and it's part of the culture. And the same thing is for hunting. All these things don't exist in Judaism, in Yiddishkeit. Hunting for sport? What is that about? It doesn't exist. The gun culture and things like that, as it exists by the Gentiles. And we'll soon, of this time, talk more about the words u'bechukosayim. Now, if we go to Parshas Kedoshim, at the end of Parshas Kedoshim, the pasuk says, and this is in Kapitel Chav, pasuk Chav Gimel, the beginning of Shvi, V'lo yiselchu b'chukos hagoy. Do not follow the traditions of the nation. Asher ani mishalech mipneichem, that I expel from before you. Ki es kol eila osu, for they did all of these. V'okotzbom, and I was disgusted with them. So I'm not going to elaborate now on the idea of v'okotzbom, that I was disgusted with them. But let's just focus on the Torah in Parshas Acharei is speaking about immoral relations, immoral intimate relations. And so too over here in Parshas Kedoshim, he repeats the subject and talks about it. And in both places, it mentions this idea of how we shouldn't go in their ways, how these other nations do not have any sort of morality in family purity, etc. But there's another point over here. And that is, from this pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, and I'm not sure why we actually learn more from this pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim and not the previous pasuk, but one of the 613 commandments, negative, is the mitzvah of lo leches b'chukos hagoyim, not to go in the ways of the goyim, halichos b'chukos hagoyim. Now the Rambam, in his Mishnah Torah, where does he put these laws? Where does he mention this loisaser? In Hilches Avodah Zarah, in the laws of idolatry. So it's not only about like Kedusha, how it's connected to the laws of remaining pure Jews and not intermarrying and people they now have a relation with. It's about the whole idea of Avodah Zarah, which in my humble opinion adds to the gravity and to the seriousness of this concept. Now, just for a second, I want to talk about, to realize what are the ramifications or what comes out of this concept of not to go in the ways of the Goyim. So if we look at the Shulchan Aruch, where it talks about these things, it talks about fashion, it talks about dress code, it talks about hairstyles, and it talks about names. We'll maybe get to this later. So this is so profound in a way that we're talking about, it starts, where is it rooted in? The concept of Avodah Zarah, idolatry. And from this concept that a Jew has to stay away from idolatry, prevention, and being careful, that evolves, that connects to the hairstyle of a Jew, the dress code of a Jew, the names of a Jew, etc. By the way, of course, tattoos are included in this. We're not judging anybody, we're talking about the Jewish law. Okay, so now let's go back to the concept. And we'll talk about it a bit. Because you could ask yourself the question, is it so bad? Is it so bad? You know, what happens if I like, it's a fashion, this is the fashion, I like this fashion, I can't wear this fashion? So, I'm not the rabbi. Go to your rabbi and ask him what this halacha means, not to go in the ways of the goyim exactly. When do we say it? When don't we say it? When does it apply? What does it really mean? But we have to start, as usual, with the approach, with the attitude. So the first thing is, you have to realize, and we spoke about this many times, like there's certain things in life, once you see the world through such a lens, things become clear, you start thinking different. So recently we had a share and we spoke about once you look at the world, that there's Kedusha, Klipas Noiga, and Sholosh Klipas Atmeis. Everything in the world falls into one of these three categories. Now I'm going to take it about differently, because first we have to go back to your very identity. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes in a certain talk that every once in a while, any human being, by definition, if he's a human being, naturally asks himself, who am I? What am I? What does it mean that I'm a being? An animal does not have that consciousness, that self-consciousness. A human being has that self-consciousness where he asks himself, who am I? What am I? What does it mean that I'm a human? So now let's take it a bit broader. I always tell my students, Sedom Menschlichkeit, which you could also say means human etiquette, human manners, human behavior. But like in the Yiddish language, you say, Sei a Mensch, means be a person of character. Be a mensch, be a man. But it means in the most positive sense. So there's Menschlichkeit, there's Yiddishkeit, then there's Chassidishkeit, and then there's Chassidus Chabad. So that's, if I'm talking to my students, I'll say, there's being a human, a Gentile, and there's a code of conduct for a human. Then there's a Jew, and what's a code of conduct of a Jew? A morality and ethics. And then there's a Chassid. You call yourself a Chassid. And then there's a Lubavitcher Chassid. A Lubavitcher Chassid. Now, of course, when I say a human and a goy, that's the difference. That God chose the Jews. It's a whole different story. And the rest, what I spoke about, being a Chassid and being a Chabad Chassid, that's more about not an essential difference. It's just that if you belong to a certain tribe, there's Reuven, Shimon, there's Levi, there's Yehuda. If you're in Shevet Yehuda, what does it mean you're in Shevet Yehuda? If you're in Shevet Levi, what does it mean you're in Shevet Levi? Okay, but I'm just telling you, my friend. So, if you're a Yid, so first you have to understand, there's Menschlichkeit and there's Yiddishkeit. What does it mean that you're a Jew? If you belong to a certain branch, group, if you want to call yourself Mizrahi, or if you want to call yourself Satmar or Litvish, then you have to ask yourself, what does that mean? Now, those differences, or particularism, is not really essential. Those are things you could change, those are things you could choose. But when it comes to Jew or non-Jew, that's already essence, etc. So, now, when we look at the entire Torah, and you can say, this two Parshas in particular, it's really all about training and developing and fostering what is a Jew. And it says in the Pasuk, Va'atem tili mamleches kohenim v'goy kodesh. You should be unto me a nation of priests and a holy nation. So that is what a Jew is. We have a standard of mamleches kohenim v'goy kodesh. If you're a holy prince, and Hashem chose the Jewish nation, va'atem tili mamleches kohenim v'goy kodesh, so understand that everything that's connected, as we spoke a couple of weeks ago about kashrus, kosher, and the same thing is over here, illicit relations, and the whole idea of u'b'chukisei l'selechu, it's about bringing out your true self, bringing out who you truly are to the maximum. The greatest crime is when you have an undeveloped potential. If you are a Jew, a chelik elikam imal mamish, you have to understand that in order for you to live a true life, and therefore the happiest life, because it's in sync with who you really are, and that's the only way you'll be happy, so then you have to follow the code that brings and fosters and develops this. Okay. So once we look at it like that, look at the whole Chumash. Forget about rules, regulations, and restrictions. Look at it. Imagine you read a book, How to Be Your Best Self. And imagine it was the secrets of life. How to be a guaranteed success. How to have a guaranteed life of happiness. How to have a guaranteed life of inner peace and tranquility, etc., etc. So, of course, would you follow that? Now, the same thing is for a Yid. The Eibishter gave the Yidden a Torah, and every single thing of the Torah, the entire Torah is B'shvil Yisrael. It's for a Yid, and the whole reason of everything is to bring out the neshama, to bring out their better self, their true self. Okay, now let's move on. Once we look at everything in that way, everything is about empowerment, and everything is about growth, and everything is about positivity and development. So now we come to another point connected to this. And I think we spoke about this many times. There's the inner-outside approach, and there's the outside-inside approach. There's two ways how a person becomes developed. And this is very essential to Tanya, those that have learned Tanya. And the whole Tanya is a question of how does a person get excited about Yiddishkeit. We understand that God commands us to do things. I can force myself to do something, whether I'm in the mood of it or not, whether I'm excited about it or not. But how do I become happy about it? How is my emotions part of it? How are my feelings part of it? How do I feel good about it? So that's the question. And in general, there's two answers. I mean, Chassidus talks about both, but the Tanya, in general, talks more about the idea of the inside-outside approach. That's what Pnimius HaTorah, the inner dimension of Torah, is about. Once you look at yourself and you know who you really are, find out about yourself. Once you understand your nature, once you understand your identity, then automatically you'll see that's the real you. Stop banging your head against the wall. You can't fight reality. This is the reality. Embrace it. So the inside-outside approach is, let's say, for example, if you went to a therapist, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and you told them you have a certain problem, so there's two ways how it can be dealt with. One way is the inside-outside approach, therapy, hypnosis, going back to your childhood. It might take 20 sessions, it might take 30 sessions. We have to examine everything of your past, talk about it, bring it out in the open. That's one way. So that's the inside-outside approach, where you're changing the person from the inside. We have to get to your history. We have to get to the root. We have to look at what's going on from the inside, outside. When we fix the inside, then we're able to fix the outside. Change your perspective. Change your mindset. Reframe it. And you'll experience things in a different way. So that's one approach. And that's very much in tune and in sync with Torah Chassidus, which is Pnimius HaTorah. So you have to learn how to look inside your intellect, look inside your emotions, make meditation, develop positive emotions, etc. Then there's another way, which is called the outside-inside approach. I'm mentioning Tanya, even though I didn't really get into the specifics of what the Tanya talks about, but one of the major points of Tanya, which we've spoken many times, is the distinction between a person's koiches, those are his inner faculties, his intellect and his emotions, and his levushim, which is called the garments, which are his actions. Thought, speech, and deed. I don't want to get into thought, how it's one of your actions, but speech is an action, which means that it doesn't necessarily reflect who you are. I could say 2 + 2 is 17. I know it's not true, I don't believe that it's true, but I could say 2 + 2 is 17. There, I just said it. And the same thing is I could do something, whether I believe in it or I don't believe in it, whether I'm passionate about it or not. You want me to go like this now? I just went like this 3 times. You want me to say, nah, I just did that. Whatever. I don't believe in it. I think it's ridiculous. I'll do you a favor. You asked me to do that. But the outside-inside approach is a word from the Sefer HaChilech, a famous thing, that ha'odam nimshech achar pulosov. Habits, routine, structure have an impact on the emotions, on the faculties. So the same thing is about life. We talk about a person. So one approach is, like we said, we're going to have to go into therapy for 10 years. We're going to dig deep. That's the inside-outside approach. Then we have the outside-inside approach, which is more immediate. So let's say I went to a therapist. Excuse me. I went to a therapist and I told him about my problems. If he's going with the outside-inside approach, he's going to be more about, stop that. In other words, he's going to give me tips, which are more immediate, which are more practical, which immediately causes a certain level of prevention and good guidance, good advice. So, in other words, the inside-outside approach obviously is deeper, but it could take much longer. Much, much longer. But then there's the outside-inside approach where it's much more immediate, much more direct, and it also helps. And the real thing is you need both. To complete the person in the best way possible, you need both. As a side point, in my humble personal opinion, I think the world has put too much an emphasis on the inside-outside approach instead of the outside-inside approach, and therefore we have a lot of the problems of today. What I mean to say is the Rebbe pushed Sheva Mitzvah, the 7 Noahide laws that is for the world, but it hasn't influenced the world enough, and I believe possibly we didn't really get the message enough. But I believe if the world would say that, would accept the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, which would mean the outside-inside approach, these things have to be followed. This is the legislation. You see how the world will become such an unbelievable better place. Now, does that mean that the people really changed inside? So the answer is, first of all, the whole world will change as soon as people will be keeping those laws. It'll be a much, 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 much better world. And we're also adding to that, that the people will change also long term. Because that's the way it works. That's what we learn from Yiddishkeit. That the outside has an impact on the inside. Okay, so now that we understand these two approaches, now let's get back to this mitzvah of you're not allowed to copy the non-Jew. It's connected to, number one, a sense of your identity. Who are you? And everything you have to be doing has to be in sync with your identity, i.e., it enhances it, and not the opposite, number one. And number two, now we understand, especially in light of the outside-inside approach, that what's on the outside actually impacts what's on the inside. So if you have a neshama, you have a Jewish soul, which is a part of Hashem himself, and therefore the standard is v'atem til imam lechas kohenim v'goy kodesh. Now you're going to do stuff on the outside, let's say, on a very simplistic level. I don't want to go deep now. The damage that a person can do to himself. But we're saying that even external things, called chitzonius, even external things, has an impact. And the Eibush is the one who wrote the health manual. And we're saying even things from the outside, which you call external, has an impact on the inside. And therefore, this idea that you're different because you're a Jew, that difference has to also be on the outside. Because the outside has an impact on the inside. So let's talk about that idea for a second. There's a famous Gemara, a quote which is brought down in Chassidus many times. Rabbi Yochanan Kai Lemone Mechabdoisai. He called his clothes those that honor me. Like we say, clothes make the man. Dress for success. So in the same way, there's the spiritual way. There's for the Jew, the clothes that makes the Jew, enhances and fosters and encourages and brings out your soul. Dress for success, for spiritual success, for Jewish success. And the same thing is true with hairstyles and fashion and all these things. Now, in connection with this, there's a couple of stories in Vetach. We're just bringing out an approach right now, my friends. So, first of all, there's a famous story of the Rebbe Marash. These are all things I think we spoke about before, so I'm not going to get into the details. It's a short Friday, and it's very late over here. There's a famous story that the Rebbe Marash came to a certain town, and he asked them whether they want to hear a story or they want to hear a mimer, Chassidic discourse. And usually you would say, or I don't know what he said, something to that effect. A choice between, and they didn't choose a mimer, and then they gave a talk, but it wasn't considered a Chassidic discourse, and the talk was a talk about was passt for a Chassid and was passt nicht for a Chassid. What's appropriate for a Chassid and what's inappropriate for a Chassid, or what's in accordance with what a Chassid is and what's not in accordance to what a Chassid is. That's what means was passt. What's appropriate or what's not appropriate. What's befitting, what's not befitting. And if I remember correctly, after it says this whole thing that he gave that talk, the point of this of the story of this episode that happened was that when the Rebbe Marash gave that talk, it caused such an arousal, a spiritual inspiration by the audience, by the Chassidim. If I remember correctly, it says that it was like a day of Yom Kippur, the holiest of holiest days. Now the point of this story and what the Frierdiker Rebbe recounts it is that when a person lives in such a way that he's asking himself, and the Rebbe Marash made a whole list, like what, first he went like what's appropriate, what's befitting, and then he made a whole list, what's inappropriate and not befitting. So the point is, once a person sets up his life in such a way, you have to look at it in such a way. If I am the B'nai Yechidei Shel Melech Malchei Amlochem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ata v'chatonu mikol ha'amim, Shelo yosani goy, then I have to live my life in such a way. Was passt for a Yid, or was passt nicht for a Yid. And it changes your whole life, because it's connected to your very identity. Is it true to who you are, or it's not true to who you are? If it's true to who you are, so then it's honor, and it's virtuous. And if it's not true to who you are, so then it's an embarrassment, and it's shameful. It's a low standard. So that's one story about was passt for a chassid, was passt nicht for a chassid. Now there's another story. There's so much to talk about. So I'm sure I said this story before because it's one of my favorite stories of the Rebbe, and there's a lot what to say about this story. But it's already late, so I'm just going to say the kitzur very, very, very quickly. There's a certain person who was an Lubavitcher, and he was a student, and he was growing a beard. But he was getting a lot of trouble for it, from his family, from his friends, from the school that he was in. Anyways, he decided to go into Yechidus from the Rebbe. I think he was from Detroit. And he decided he's going to go into Yechidus of the Rebbe. And when he gets into Yechidus of the Rebbe, he's going to ask the Rebbe, tell the Rebbe that he's having difficulties with growing a beard. What should he do? So the Rebbe, I don't know how they got into it, but somehow the Rebbe started speaking about the Yidden in Mitzrayim. And it says the Yidden in Mitzrayim were Mitzuyonim. Outstanding, exceptional. And what does it say about them? Leishinu Eshmam, they didn't change their names. Leishinu Es Lashonim, they didn't change their language. Leishinu Es Levushim, they didn't change their garments. And then the Rebbe said, it doesn't say anywhere that they did this L'Shem Shemayim. It doesn't say anywhere that they did this for Hashem's sake. It just says that they didn't change the names of the garments or the language. And for that honor and that merit, they were redeemed from Egypt. And then the Rebbe said, like for example, the hippies of today, which at that time most average people looked at the hippies like they're wild and crazy. They're not even civilized. They're all dropouts, walking around with long hair and protesting all the time. And the Rebbe went on to say, like the hippies, the Shino Shmam, and he mentioned famous names, Jewish names, Jews, that were part of this culture, counterculture, I don't know what you call them. He said some names of the people that were leading this movement, the hippies movement. They were Jewish names. I think he said Ginsburg. It's a pity I didn't look up the story before I said it now. And then he said, so they didn't change their names, like the hippies, and he said the names of the hippies, L'Shonim, they didn't change the language. And then he said, like they have a certain language, the hippies. And then he said they didn't change their garments. They wear certain clothes, ponchos, and they have beards. And the Rebbe said, look at this, wow. Just because they retained their cultural difference, that itself gave them merit that they should be redeemed. Anyways, the person who says the story says, once the Rebbe said that, and the Rebbe mentioned beard, that the hippies were wearing beards, and in that merit, they deserve to be redeemed. So he said, of course, I wasn't going to bring it up after the Rebbe said those words, and he didn't even have a chance yet to speak about this. Now, this story is so amazing. We don't have the time to get into it. But what I want to bring out is, and really this is something which I wanted to get into, the idea of B'chukiseyim. There's so much that goes on in the world that people follow, because that's the way it is. In the Maimer of Basi Lagani, of the Friedrich Rebbe, he speaks about Shtus to Kedusha and Shtus to Klippe. And that's one of the reasons, maybe we'll have to leave this for another time, why it says B'chukiseyim. It's like a chok, it doesn't make sense. As Rashi emphasizes a bit. Maybe that's what he's trying to say. The Friedrich Rebbe says, for example, the fixed times of lunch, of food, of meals. And the Friedrich Rebbe says, so many people follow how, what do you mean? If I don't eat at this time every single day, I'm not a person, b'chlal. But when it comes to the fixed times of studying and davening, he's lax. When it comes to the fixed time that he takes a shower or eats food, that he's super careful with. And so on and so forth. There's so many things. Like, for example, you have to read the newspaper. I'm giving you the image of the typical, stereotypical image of, you sit down in the morning and you read the headlines, the newspapers, while you're drinking your orange juice and you're having your scrambled eggs. And if you won't read the newspaper, you're less of a man. Biswinzigere Yid, Mensch. No, but what do you mean? If you don't read the newspaper, you don't know the headlines. You don't know what's going on. So who says you have to know what's going on? Especially if it's fake news. I'm just saying, so there's certain things that are engraved, like Rashi says, etched. That's also Chukoisei Miloshen Chikike. And a Yid has to know, we follow a different music. We're dancing to a different tune. And this is the Moed de Kazach. So this is the message that we're getting from Parshas Acharei and Kedoshim. Understand, what does it mean to be a Yid? What does it mean that you're a Yid? What does it mean to be a Yid? What difference does it make, really deep down, in your understanding of your identity, of who you are? And from there flows everything about asking yourself, where does this come from? What is this? Is this Yiddishkeit? Or it has nothing to do with Yiddishkeit? And there's so much of what's going on around you, in your environment, that really has nothing to do with Yiddishkeit, and doesn't have to be. And that's actually the mitzvah. Don't do it just because that's what everyone else is doing. So the Eibishter helping that when the Eibishter sees that we, each and every single one of us, are bringing out our Jewish identity, our neshama, more and more, so the Eibishter do his part and help us that all our neshamas should be able to be taken out of Golus, Begula Mitzvah Shlema, taken from Yad Mamish, posting from my home, Be'ez Hashem Yisborich, your man in Melbourne.